As chair of the School of Journalism and Strategic Media at the University of Arkansas, we're glad you're here for this forum. Fake news, alternative facts, half-truths, innuendos, lies, shades of gray, situational dilemmas. Journalists contend with these issues and accusations and questions every day. Here in our school at the University of Arkansas, we take the telling of the truth all of the time incredibly seriously. Ethics is at the forefront of what we teach our students. In fact, all of our roughly 640 students, whether they're enrolled in news editorial classes, broadcast journalism classes, advertising or public relations classes, all of them are required to take and pass an upper-level journalism ethics class. We'd like to thank you for coming. We'd like to thank the Center for Journalism Ethics, a great part of our school, and its director, Ray McCaffrey, and graduate assistant, Annette Sosa, for making this event possible. We're also glad to have had this semester with us is our distinguished journalism professor of ethics, Lisa Shepard, your host and MC for tonight's program. Lisa.
False, misleading, fraudulent, misinformation out there, but news by definition is not fake. And our president has co-opted the F word and uses it for any story or poll that he doesn't like. And he's also used it to attack us. And I've been thinking about this, and I know that we had the F word in the program, in the flyer, but it's also about getting to real news. But when we use the F word, when the media uses the F word, I think that we reinforce this attack. So anyway, I wanted to also start out on a positive note, that journalism really does matter, and especially good journalism. And I thought many of you are probably familiar with the series that the New York Times did about Harvey Weinstein, and that this was the beginning of a long overdue reckoning about sexual assault and harassment. And one of the reporters, Jodi Kantor, said that she hopes that one of the takeaways is that journalism works. And I thought we might, one example would be Tom Marino, who was the congressman from Pennsylvania that Donald Trump picked to be the head of the DEA, the drug czar. And the Washington Post and 60 Minutes exposed him as someone who had pushed through legislation to make it easier to get opioid drugs. And he ended up withdrawing. I wonder if you all have any examples of good journalism.
I have lots of them.
Would you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello everybody. I'm Paul Farri. I'm with the Washington Post. I cover the media, so this is kind of my wheelhouse. I will say in general, as an overview, this is one of the best times to be a journalist. There is so much news, and there's so much news in what I do, in just covering the media. It's been the best time, I think, of my career because there is heightened interest, and the stakes and the consequences are so high. And we have an impact, and as much as the president beats on us, it kind of makes us in some ways stronger. I think we have a great resolve. As our editor Marty Barron said, every time the president challenges us, we're not at war, we're at work. And that's really a great model. There's a sense of enthusiasm, a sense of spirit and mission in what we do. Great journalism. The Harvey Weinstein story has been a watershed. I'm amazed by what has followed it. I'm also amazed by what didn't happen before it. I was saying earlier to the class that we've had some high-profile sexual harassment stories, one of which was the claims against Roger Ailes at Fox News, and then followed by the claims against Bill O'Reilly, which drove him out. But that didn't set off this chain reaction. That didn't create this, reckoning for harassers and assaulters the way this Weinstein story has. And I'm mystified as to why one thing did, but the other thing didn't. But it's all good journalism.
Okay, Indira?
Yeah, I
Would you
mean,
introduce yourself?
of course. I'm Indira Lakshmanan. I'm currently the Newmark Chair in Journalism Ethics at the Poynter Institute, which if you don't know about it, as students of journalism, I hope you all look us up at poynter.org. We're the leading journalism think tank, thought leadership and training for professional journalists. I'm also a columnist for the Boston Globe and a longtime journalist for the last 27 years, a foreign correspondent and national correspondent. And I think that I agree completely with Paul that this is sort of a golden age of journalism in a way, almost as a result of being goaded as enemies of the people, which of course we're not, being goaded as fake news, which of course we're not. I think journalists have thrown themselves even harder into their mission and into their work, which is of course accountability. I think that most of you are studying journalism because you believe in holding public officials accountable. That's what we do. And I think that although some things about our work are harder now, revenue is down, nobody has really sort of broken the code and figured out what to do after the end of classified advertising. And so many people read news for free and don't subscribe, and I would encourage all of you to please subscribe to whatever your news sources are because they need your money. And that's not just NPR and PBS. Everybody needs your money because you can't do good journalism without it. But there are so many people now who are throwing themselves into terrific investigative accountability journalism. And that includes things like the Paradise Papers, which just came out, showing, rich people and powerful people around the world and how they've shielded their money and corporations. The Panama Papers before that. I'm also thinking of the incredible journalism that Politico did, exposing Tom Price and other cabinet secretaries taking on the taxpayer dime over $500,000 worth of flights around the world, which in the end he had to step down for, but he hasn't made any noise about reimbursing us taxpayers that over $500,000 that he spent. A story from my hometown, Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette got a hold of texts between U.S. congressman from Pittsburgh and his mistress. And what was significant about this was that it was hypocrisy, that the man was one of the biggest opponents of abortion rights in Congress and had sponsored anti-abortion bills, and his text showed him urging his mistress to get an abortion. And all sorts of things that came out in these texts that forced him to step down. So, there is a lot of accountability out there, and it pains me when I see, and we'll get to this later, I know Lisa's planning to talk about this, but it pains me to see the sort of partisan polarization in this country that has gone beyond politics and into media consumption and media trust. And I'll leave it there, but let me just say that we're certainly not fake news, but it's painful to see how that matters. I'm going to use it, sorry. But it really is difficult how based on political affiliation people trust or don't trust the so-called mainstream media.
Steve, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Steve Holmes. My title is Executive Director of News Standards and Practices at CNN. So let me first define exactly what that is. News Standards and Practices is an office in CNN. We've had it for about 20 years now. That is part of a quality control team to make sure that the stories we do, the accountability stories we do especially, are fair, accurate, balanced, tasteful, and don't embarrass the network. And the reason why I think this kind of office is incredibly important these days goes to some of what panel's been saying about we are in incredibly fraught times when it comes to journalism. We have lower levels of trust in media. We have an administration that sees itself as actively at war with journalists. And as a result, we have to make sure, as my boss, Jeff Zucker, would say, that we play error-free ball, that we make as few mistakes as possible. No one could say we never will make a mistake. It's impossible. We're not perfect institutions. Because any institution is run by people, and people are not perfect. So mistakes will be made. But if you have a system like you have at CNN, which carefully vets the stories especially the accountability stories, that we will publish or will either air on TV or publish digitally. It is critically important that we make sure these stories are right, they're fair, they're balanced, they're tasteful, then they're not going to be attacked. Or if they are attacked, we know that the attacks are really kind of bogus. So, and yes, I've been personally involved in vetting some very important stories. A few years ago, CNN basically kind of took the lead in exposing various issues at the Veterans Administration. It cost the then Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Shinseki, his job. CNN also was the first news organization to break the infamous dossier concerning Donald Trump, although we made a decision at the time not to print the contents of the dossier for lots of reasons, which we might want to get into later on. But these were enormously important stories, and stories that we knew that there would be a lot of pushback. The dossier story, I remember there was a group from Standards and Practice, our legal department, and other editors. We went through that story line by line because we could not afford to make any mistakes in that story. So journalism these days has tremendous responsibilities, but we have to make sure that we live up to these responsibilities. And I'm proud to say that I hope with my office in some little way will help us live up to those responsibilities.
Okay. So we're going to talk about trust in the media. And while the idea of a golden age of trustworthy media may be a myth, there was a high point of American trust in the media, according to Gallup polls. And that was in 1976. Many of you weren't even born. Your parents might not have been either. When 72% of those polls said they trusted the media a great deal or a fair amount. Fast forward to 2016, and only 32% of the respondents claimed the same trust in the media, which was down more than 20 points since 1997. And by the way, the United States isn't the only nation that's facing a skeptical citizenry. In at least 17 countries worldwide, trust in the media has plunged to an all-time low. So we're going to begin with Indira. What can we do to improve the trust in addition to doing good, solid journalism?
Well, there was a young woman who was going to help me show my slides, because I have some slides of this. A blonde student who is going to help me show my slides. Okay, well, I'll talk through them until they find her. I was going to show you that Gallup poll because what I think is interesting about it, the one that Lisa mentioned, is that Gallup actually only started looking at, I have a few caveats about this whole trust question. Gallup only started looking at trust in the media in the 1970s, so we don't have any data going back further than that. The Pew Research Center, very trustworthy, reliable organization in Washington, has only been looking at media credibility since the 1990s, so we have a limited set of data here. Personally, my own view is that the 1970s was probably a high water mark and an irregular high water mark, because in the history of this country, prior to the networks, the rise of the three networks in the 1950s, we really had partisan newspapers in towns. So you would have like the Union paper, you would have the Communist paper, you would have the sort of Fat Cats paper. Papers had points of view, morning and evening papers. So I don't think that partisanship and trust in media, distrust in media is a new phenomenon. I think that if anything, it was almost irregular that from the 1950s to the 1970s, there was this phenomenon of Americans sitting down in front of the television set and watching ABC, CBS, NBC, and, having a sort of uniform experience where everyone could say, oh, I'm watching Walter Cronkite tonight, or Huntley Brinkley, or people who you may not have heard of. But the point was that it was sort of like a uniform diet that was being given to them of half an hour's worth of trusted news, and they trusted it. Also in the aftermath of Vietnam and what the press did in exposing that, in the aftermath of Watergate and what the press did in exposing that, I think there was sort of this high watermark of trust in the media. I don't think it's so strange that it's gone down since then, but some of that has to do with, in the 1980s, under Ronald Reagan, the sort of deregulation of the FCC, the elimination of the Fairness Doctrine, the rise of right-wing talk radio as a result, the rise of cable news, and the fact that Fox News made it its business mission and its whole sort of model of saying, don't trust everyone else, don't trust the mainstream media. Talk radio did the same thing, trust us. We're the ones who are giving you the real voice. What this did is it fed an entire generation of people who happen to be largely an older generation of Fox viewers since the 1990s, who have been watching this and taking this in and believing it. The internet has also really magnified this. There are so many hyper-partisan news sources that exist now, and not only actual websites like Breitbart, which you might have heard of, or Alternet on the right and on the left, but there are also just Reddit groups and 4chan and all sorts of places you can go down the rabbit holes of the internet and be told lots of things that aren't true. So there are groups like, InfoWars, run by Alex Jones, who you may have heard of in Austin, Texas, who has a huge, huge following and was interviewed by Megyn Kelly as her third interview of this new show she had on NBC, her Sunday night show, giving a real platform to this guy, but this is a guy who Donald Trump had already given a platform to. This is a conspiracy theorist who says that Sandy Hook never happened, that it was child actors, that 9/11 was an inside job. I mean, all sorts of really crazy, harmful, hurtful things. So part of that is there's a lot of crazy trash out there. And it's unfortunate, but people are sort of convinced to believe it. And I think we'll get to this later, but news literacy is an important part of sort of defending ourselves against the onslaught of false information that comes out, and it comes out for a variety of reasons. You're right that trust was at a historic low last fall, in September of 2016. Actually, trust in media has gone up since then, I'm happy to report. Not substantially, but it has gone up. But again, one of the slides I wanted to show you was to show how completely, how much this is against along partisan lines. When you look, there was a Marist poll just last month that showed that Democrats vastly trust the media and don't trust Donald Trump. Republicans, it's exactly the opposite. So in a sense, it depends on your sample size. When you're looking at the entire, your whole poll, how many of them are Republicans, how many are independents, how many are Democrats, is going to skew what your result is. To go back to your question of how do we address trust, I think part of this is on the consumer to educate themselves and look at the URL that you're looking at and figure out, is it really abcnews.com or is it abcnews.co, right? Which is one of these sites that was set up by this famous purveyor of fake news who died just a couple months ago, had made all sorts of sites that were fake. So educate yourself. Check sources, make sure that you know that it's real. So part of it's on the consumer. Part of it is on internet platform companies like Facebook. And they have been, since January, doing a program to flag disputed stories, to flag things that are potentially fake or wrong. And at Pointer, which is home to the International Fact-Checking Network, they've partnered with Washington Post Fact Checker, PolitiFact, and others to help flag these stories. And we think it's helping, but Facebook has not been very transparent about letting us know exactly how well that's working. So that's one thing that's going on.
Can I just add that when you say, do you trust the media, I know, Paul, you wrote about this. What the heck do we mean?
Yeah.
And it's, do you trust the New York Times? Do you trust the Arkansas Democrat Gazette? Do you trust Breitbart? Do you trust BBC? I mean, people will say, no, I don't trust the media, but I do trust the BBC.
Hey, Lisa, can I just jump in here for one quick thing? When we talk about, let's sort of define the landscape a little bit. And Derek touched on this. When you talk about the dropping trust in the media, you're really talking about the dropping trust in the media amongst Republicans. That's essentially what they're talking about. There's been an erosion of trust amongst Democrats and independents, there's no question about it. But the real fall off has been amongst Republicans. So, and it's not surprising, and Indira mentioned this, when you have a president, a titular head of their party, saying don't trust the media, when you have, the main source of news for many of these Republicans, Fox News and others, saying don't trust the media. And when they say the media, they're talking about large national media organizations like New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, et cetera, et cetera. That's what they're talking about. So when we're talking about how do you restore trust in the media, what you're asking is how are you going to restore trust amongst Republicans in the media? And that is a really daunting task.
That's absolutely right.
You're really, it's a tough slog, and the headwinds are really against you. There are ways I think we can work on it, but let's not kid ourselves. I mean, we're not,
I think that's true, but I also think that the proliferation of unverified information that you get every day, whether it's on Google or Facebook or Twitter, is having an effect on with people feeling like I don't know what to believe. And I agree that it's probably more Republicans having this, but I think many people just feel confused. And I mentioned a friend who said someone I know, someone who is educated and reads the newspaper, and someone who you wouldn't expect to say, I just don't know what to believe anymore. So I think it's a bigger problem than just Republicans.
But I don't know what to believe anymore is a reflection of the way the media has changed. So there's a fire hose every day of information coming at you.
Right.
How do you differentiate it? And to talk, again, this is a hobby horse of mine, to talk about the media is to talk in broad abstractions that make no sense whatsoever. So if I went around this room and asked you what the media was, we'd probably end up with 120 different news sources and news outlets. And when we talk about trust in the media, we're talking about political news, and we're not really talking about trust in the local, reporting about the fire department or the
weather
or the team, and we're talking about your or my presidential candidate. So you need to boil that down a bit more. It's like asking people, do you trust Congress? No, of course people don't trust Congress, but they trust their member of Congress because they voted for him. Do you trust the Arkansas newspaper? You probably do if you subscribe to it. And if you say you don't, then why are you subscribing to it? So this question irritates me ultimately because I actually think people don't know what they're talking about.
Paul's exactly right in that there was a study that just came out from the Shorenstein Center at Harvard not long ago that was that basically said, people trust. What does it mean, trust? It's like, oh no, I think it was the American Press Institute. I trust my media. I don't trust the media. Mm-hmm. So what that indicates is, people who are Fox viewers, they trust Fox.
They love Fox.
They just don't trust everyone else.
Right.
This is a long-standing problem in the sense that there are many long roots in people trusting their local newspaper and not trusting national news. Now, here's a problem, which all of you, I'm sure, are aware of, the erosion of local news. It's a huge problem, and it's a huge threat to our democracy. And media deserts, as they exist all over this country, and I'm sure they exist in Arkansas too, they're a real risk, I believe, to democracy. Interestingly, there is some mapping that shows if you overlay media deserts, where there is no local news source, with voting districts in 2016, there was a huge correlation between Trump voters and media deserts. And I wonder about this because these are people who aren't getting their own local trusted source of news. They're relying entirely on cable news or crazy stuff on the internet, potentially. So I think one of the solutions to this is bolstering local news.
And the notion of not knowing what to believe, I think, is a kind of form of laziness.
Yes.
Because it's very simple. If you don't recognize the source of the information, don't trust it. If you do recognize the source of the information, maybe CNN, maybe the Washington Post, maybe whatever, It's very likely it's true. Now, we don't always get the story right. We are often wrong in certain details. But in the main, I really defy anyone to show me something that we have been consistently wrong about. And I'll debate you on it because we weren't consistently wrong about it. You can point and cherry pick, but for the most part, the mainstream media gets it right. And when it doesn't, it corrects itself.
If I could just pull up maybe a little discordant note here. I mean, so far we're talking about, and we're putting the onus on the news consumers.
Yes.
I do believe that major media, and again, when I talk about major media, I'm talking about, large national news organizations, do bear some responsibility here. And the area where I think where I feel that we have some responsibility is I often believe that the news, I think our news is fair and unbiased. I think our story selection tends to represent a particular demographic that tends to be the ones that don't trust us. And in part, they don't trust us because they don't feel that we're speaking to them. All right? Let me give you an example, okay? 2 stories. I'm sorry, let me give you an example. That's right, there's all these people out there. In the early days of the Trump administration, Congress passed a law, and President Trump signed it, that overturned an Obama-era regulation regarding overtime, who would qualify for overtime. Basically, who would qualify to be a supervisor. It probably impacted thousands of people, mainly working class people. That story got very, very little play. A few months ago, the Trump administration said that they were basically putting a ban on transgender individuals in the military. That story got enormous play, probably affected maybe 1,500, 2,000 people. Now, I'm not saying it's not an important story, don't get me wrong, but compared to the number of people impacted by the overturning of the overtime rule, the difference in the amount of coverage was monumental. And it, I think, solidifies a view amongst a lot of people, basically working class whites, who are, if you look at a lot of the polling, are the ones who really say they really distrust major media. It sort of reinforces in their minds that the major media isn't talking about us. And I think that's an area that we have to take a really hard look at ourselves and decide that, are we going to cover this whole country, or are we going to cover just a certain demographic that tends to be people like us?
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that that is part of also the story of 2016, of course, of
Right.
our largely, coastal reporters coming in with a certain preconceived notion, reading polls a certain way, and leaving out the voices of a lot of people who ended up being the deciding factor.
I disagree completely.
Well, you disagree with me in a sec. So I think that's part of it. But I think
have
that
permission in the thing.
Yeah,
Sorry.
disagree with them 100%. But I think you're right that some of this is about diversity in newsrooms. And there are some newsrooms who are taking an active, I think every newsroom represented here is taking active measures to make sure that they have a diverse newsroom. And specifically at the New York Times, they have gone out and tried to find some reporters who are like evangelical Christians. They've tried to find reporters who were veterans. They've tried to find reporters who are gun owners, trying to find reporters who represent different things. I think but, I also think that there are other factors that involve, I don't think it's just working class whites who don't trust the media. Frankly, again, I think it goes back to what you said earlier about it being Republicans who don't trust the mainstream media. I sat next to a guy on the plane coming here to Arkansas who was very rich, a entrepreneur, business owner, and when he asked me, oh, what are you going to be talking about? And when I told him, he immediately launched into a whole tirade against the media. This is not a working class guy. He's not uneducated. He just said, the first thing you guys did was say about how Donald Trump's inauguration didn't have enough people, and that is just so wrong. He said, I was there, it was packed. And I said, well, sir, with all respect, I've lived in D.C. for 10 years, covered other inaugurations, it was not the same number. Well, there was not a seat to be had, and those pictures were fake. And so, some of this is also...
People believe what they want to
Yes,
believe, and-
Right.
yes, and
the
it's
problem
echo chambers, and it's filter bubbles and all of that. Yeah, confirmation bias,
And
yes.
we're not obligated to present to that person a false reality.
Exactly,
No, we're not, certainly.
That's all.
exactly.
All right, let's,
Oh, can I disagree one?
oh, please.
This notion that we didn't cover the Trump voter is false because read any campaign rally story. Trump goes here,
that's
Trump
true.
goes there, Trump goes... And it wasn't just what Trump said, because that, candidates always repeat things. It's also the voices of the people who were cheering him on, the stories about them. And there were many stories about how we feel left behind by politicians and by Washington. That's why we support Trump. The notion that we ignored the Trump demographic is belied by miles and miles and miles of reporting
There was
about
tons
the
of
Trump
reporting about
demographic.
it. There was tons of reporting about it, but it was once Trump was becoming powerful in the primary. It wasn't prior to that. I think the
Right.
people who say that they were left out are talking about years of feeling neglect.
That's the point.
That's what I'm talking about.
That's the
Once
point.
Trump was rising and potentially the GOP nominee, then there were thousands of stories
Yep.
about the Trump voters.
suddenly
I think you're talking about the
discovered-
people
we
before
suddenly
that.
discovered this
Suddenly
demographic.
discovered them. They didn't know
And
about,
this
they weren't
demographic-
written about
We
in
are now
2015.
relitigating, so let's move forward. I think that, we have, obviously, this is a topic that we can talk about over and over. The other day, Steve, when I talked to you, you were telling me about an incident where CNN acted so quickly and made an error talking about Donald Trump in Japan, and that what we have now is, we have whiplash news cycles, and that puts a lot of pressure on the journalist. So you not only have the competition, but you have, somebody tweeting out something, and then they're getting retweeted and going viral. So would you tell the story? And
Sure.
I'd like you to also talk about how CNN handled this mistake and how it could have been avoided.
Well, how it could have been avoided if we,
Well,
when I-
explain what happened with Donald Trump in Japan.
Okay, but let me, when I was growing up in the 60s, we used to have this expression, speed kills. It's just as true now as it was then. What happened, probably more so.
What kind of speed?
Maybe the speed has changed, but the concept hasn't. What happened was that Trump gave a speech in Japan, and in his normal sort of stream of consciousness, New York style of speaking, said a whole bunch of things, and it was kind of all over the map, about Japanese car makers. And at one point, he said, it would be nice if you made cars in America rather than shipping them there. That was one of the sentences in his talk. And so we immediately jumped on that and wrote a story actually we labeled it a fact check. That basically pointed out that Trump didn't know what he was talking about, that 70% of the Japanese vehicles and auto parts sold in the United States are made in the United States, which is a fact. And so how could Trump be so wrong? And we had the story up. I was sitting at my desk, and all of a sudden, another person at CNN sent me an email with a copy of a Washington Post story that basically completely debunked our story because it had the full transcript of what Trump said. And yes, that sentence was in there, but prior to saying that, he congratulated a number of Japanese automakers for their long years of building cars in America. And after that sentence, he went on to say that he hoped that there would be even more investment in in American auto plants by Japanese automakers. We were wrong. All right. So I immediately got on the phone and called the editor and made him aware of the Post piece, and we sat there and talked about it. He and I went back and forth. His view was that we were completely wrong in that there was a rebuke of Japanese automakers within that comment. And it's true, there was a rebuke there. So we changed the headline. We added the other sentences that indicated that Trump did understand that Japanese automakers did make cars here. And at the bottom, we said, this is a corrected version of an original story, admitted our mistake.
But isn't this kind of an example of how people look at CNN and other news organizations as being so quick to criticize the president, to look for mistakes, to show a kind of bias?
I think it's an example of CNN being quick. Now, it might be quick to criticize the president. We were quick to kill off Gabby Giffords. You know, we were quick.
Which NPR did too.
And NPR did as well.
Gabby Giffords was the congresswoman from Arizona who probably, was it 8 or 9 years ago, was shot. And while she was in an Arizona supermarket shopping center.
At a campaign rally.
And NPR reported that she had died.
And so did CNN. And the key word here is quick. You know, it used to be when we talked about the days of the nightly newscast, or the days when I first started at the New York Times, our competition, the New York Times, we saw our competition as the Washington Post and sometimes the Wall Street Journal. Today, everyone's competition is everybody else.
Right.
Because we all are competing in the digital space, everybody. And it is, we see it as really imperative that we get stories up fast so that we get the clicks, and they don't need to go to the Post digital space because they've already read it here. So we are quick. Although Jeff Zucker will often tell you he'd rather be right than first. And we essentially try to follow that. But the pressures to be up there quickly are enormous.
But I would analyze that by saying that the reason for the mistake was this preconceived notion, which is actually a valid notion, that Trump gets it wrong a lot and makes up stuff. And I don't want to say lies, because I don't know if he's lying, but he talks a lot of crap. And he doesn't care that he talks a lot of crap. So we're poised to correct his crap. And that might have fed the...
Paul's totally right, because I mean, his own colleagues at the Washington Post fact checker have done such an incredibly wonderful, diligent job of literally every day painstakingly, keeping track of every statement he makes, and they have found that on average he makes 5 false or misleading statements a day. And the reason they say false or misleading is exactly what Paul's saying. We don't know his intent. Lie implies intent. Maybe he doesn't know that what he's saying is false, but false or misleading is a certainly accurate depiction of what he's doing. But I think that does also feed into, we are poised. The people who are constantly checking the facts are like, poised, I don't blame your CNN person you probably had a number of people who were going through that transcript line by line, listening in real time. You had your White House reporters who were listening in real time. Right. You had your White House producers who were going line by line. Someone sees that line and says, what? That's not true. Of course 70% of the cars are made, and they may have even had a pre-prepared thing about 70% of the cars, Japanese cars being made in the United States, because they've written about it before and fact-checked him on it before. Do you see what I'm saying? So, yes, I mean, both things are true.
So what you have is this perfect storm. You've got the nor'easter of wanting to be quick, running into the hurricane of, having a preconceived notion based on fact.
Based on reality.
Based on reality of Trump. And you can end up quite often, not often, but you can end up with the situations where you're just wrong. And what happens there in that is that it reinforces the view of those who don't want to trust the mainstream media. There's no question about it.
But here's another problem, Lisa, that you haven't brought up, and I think is worth bringing up, is the whole thing of false balance. We all talk about and we teach and learn about objectivity. Well, we are all supposed to be objective in the mainstream media, right? We're supposed to present both sides. The problem with really aggressive both-sidism is, though, that sometimes both sides are not equally right. And when you're giving both sides, let me give you an example. There was a story that came in for a hell of a lot of, condemnation on journalism Twitter not so long ago. There was a story that said, boy, John Kelly was really wrong in lying about this congresswoman.
Chief of Staff.
Yes, the White House Chief of Staff was really wrong in the way he spoke about Representative Wilson from Florida, and he was wrong. A video proved him to be wrong in claiming that she had claimed credit for some veterans thing, blah, blah, blah. But boy, Representative Wilson, she was also really irregular in saying that the president was rude on this phone call to the widow of this guy, the soldier who died in Niger. And people really hated that story because they said, wait a second, they're not equal things here, right? Kelly is wrong. He knowingly misrepresented the facts of what happened. We have video evidence to show it. And what Wilson did and Kelly did are not equal, so why are we giving up both sides? And since Paul writes about this every single day, I really want to hear what you think about that.
No, I get nothing really to add. The easiest example, and I will add something, is climate change. Okay, 97% of climate scientists believe that, man-made causes are leading to greater warming of the planet. They have varying disagreements about how severe this is and so on and so forth. But the general trend of science, which is the thing that tells us what reality is going in that direction. So when we cover a story about climate change and policy around it, gee, we have to balance it off with somebody. Well, I mean, this is the example of the false balance from some schmo who doesn't really know the science, but does have a vested interest in knocking the science, and will say that the scientists are wrong. So we've got to get the denier in there.
See, I don't think they do that anymore. I mean, I know that I was the ombudsman at NPR from 2007 to 2011, and they made a decision around 2010 that they were not going to do the false balance. So I don't think that that is actually...
On climate change,
Okay.
maybe, but on
Climate
politics,
change,
it
but
still
yes.
exists.
Yes, definitely.
Lisa, one other area I find where you find it's not both sidisms, but it is the media, many news organizations, kind of tiptoeing around something is, when do you call someone a liar? When do you use the L word? And when you have, as we have now, a president who says so many things which have been shown to be demonstrably untrue. I've adopted a rule of thumb on this, and that is this. If somebody says something that's wrong, you just say that it's wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
If it's pointed out to him, widely enough, him or her, that it's wrong, and they say it again, then you can call them a liar.
Well,
But then you'd
I
be
have
calling
a-
Trump a liar every day.
Yeah, we could.
I have a rule of thumb on this: never call anybody a liar.
Well,
It's
you don't.
like calling somebody a name.
Because you don't
Just
know their
point
intent.
out the fact that you're dead wrong and leave it at that. They're dead wrong.
Especially, we talked at the beginning about polarization and wanting to have conversations, and when you start using names like liar or white supremacist, as there was a tweet by Jamel Hill calling the president a white supremacist. So those kind of labels, I think, are very alienating, and they end up feeding into this, I'm on this side and I'm on that side, so.
But don't you think that part of it, Lisa, is that also this sidism is the problem is that the media, and this is something, some of it I think like it's not us, it's them. It's like if the audience doesn't get it, some of it is like it's their fault, but some of it is our fault. And I think one thing that's our fault is, particularly in cable news, there is not a distinction between what is opinion and what is reporting. And because it is so much cheaper to put talking heads up on TV, and I say this with full disclosure, I'm a talking head too, but it's so much easier to bring us into the studio and stick us up and have like 6 people looking like Hollywood squares on the screen and everybody's like arguing and giving their opinion than it is to have a reporter in the field who's doing serious journalism where they're investigating or they're reporting on something real. Again, if we go back to Fox, Fox has some terrific reporters who are doing really good journalism. And that's not the same as the commentators who are giving their opinion. And I think we should be doing a better job of labeling opinion and distinguishing it from reporting. And gosh, I also wish that we had less opinion journalism, period, on the TV. Fewer pundits and more reporting, but reporting is more expensive.
All right, we're going to wrap this up now and open up for questions, but I just want one last point, that this whole conversation dovetails into the importance of news literacy and how we all now have to employ the same skills that journalists use to distinguish between fact and fiction. And news literacy is not saying read the New York Times, don't read Breitbart. It's saying to think critically, and you just ask questions and you vet information to decide whether or not you think it is credible information. So I'd like you all to talk about what you think are the responsibilities of either news organizations, or more so, what is the responsibility of a news consumer? I passed out, and I hope you have the rights and responsibilities of news organizations and of consumers, because that's really, to me, the shift that we're in. It used to be when we were all coming up and we had Walter Cronkite or just 3 networks, we just trusted them. Now you have to be a journalist too, and you have to ask. The one question I've told lots of students here, maybe some of you could repeat it, you should always be asking, how do you know that?
Right.
What's your advice in terms of how, Steve, in terms of, and let's do it quickly,
Well, read a lot. Read a lot of different sources. Don't just read things that sort of fall into your own view of the world. You may not like Breitbart, you may not like Fox News, but you should read Breitbart on occasion, and you should read Fox News. And so read a lot and be critical of what you read wherever you read it. How do you know that? Where does this figure come from? Does that figure make sense? I gave an example. I'll do it really quickly. Everybody remember the movie Jaws? Right?
Yes.
There's a great line where Chief Brody is at a drunken dinner says to Mr. Hooper, who's played by Richard Dreyfuss, is it true that most shark attacks take place in 3 feet of water or less, 10 yards from shore? Well, think about it. That's where most people are. So wouldn't it make sense? So it's kind of a statistic that's kind of meaningless. So ask it, does this statistic or does this fact make sense, or so what? I mean, just be smart about what you read.
and also I'll just stop, pause, don't just pass on something. All of this stuff that is quote unquote F news, or if it's designed to go viral, is appealing to your emotions. So if something makes you angry, if it makes you mad, if it stokes fear in you, or curiosity or hope, any kind of emotion, it's often just designed to push your buttons, and let them pause.
Well, I'm a big fan of pushing people's buttons. I mean, we sell emotion, we sell, sad stories, we sell sensational things. I'm not so convinced that that's a bad thing. I think it's really, again, a fairly simple idea that you can vet any story anytime. If something seems too good to be true or makes you so mad, check another source. If no one else is reporting that, it's not true. And the reason for this is any story, and I said this earlier, any scoop has a shelf life of about 6 seconds before someone else is reporting the same story. So if you're seeing, Hillary Clinton hit by meteorite and, is a Martian, if that were true, that story would be in a lot of places very quickly. So once you see it, just Google it and see if anybody else is reporting it, and see who else is reporting it. If, weird-looking URLs are reporting it, it's not true.
I want to say that I do think Facebook and the other platforms have a real responsibility here, which they're doing a little bit about now, but they're not really taking on their full responsibility here. And just to give you a figure on this, in 2016, there was a fantastic study done by Craig Silverman at BuzzFeed, the media editor there, who analyzed the top 20 fake news headlines of the 2016 election and the top 20 real news headlines of the 2016 election. And what he found was that in those false, they're just completely hoax, they're just made up, the top 20 headlines were things like Pope endorses Donald Trump, or things like FBI agent investigating Hillary Clinton found dead in murder-suicide, or Pizzagate, which you may have heard of, this completely false story claiming that Hillary Clinton and her campaign manager, John Podesta, were running a child pedophilia ring out of a basement of my local pizza parlor in DC, where I take my kids, where, by the way, there ain't a basement. There's no basement there, right? And a guy actually came up from North Carolina with a gun on a day that we were taking our family to it, and we got stopped at the edge by a police tape because a guy was in there shooting his gun off thinking that he was going to be freeing child victims who didn't exist. So those top...
No one was hurt.
Thank goodness no one was hurt. So the top 20 false news stories outperformed on Facebook last year the top 20 real news stories from CNN, The Washington Post, The Boston Globe, The New York Times, by between 1.3 million and 1.4 million additional pieces of engagement, likes, and shares. Okay, that is on consumers who are passing that stuff around without checking it, and that's on Facebook, which is making it all look the same. So there wasn't a logo that made it clear this is the Washington Post, and this is like the Denver made-up blah blah Times, a completely made-up news thing that doesn't actually exist. You know, that's just some guys in their pajamas sitting in a basement writing things and trying to get pennies for eyeballs, you know, penny ads for every time you click on it. So that is the point, that you need to also be careful, and we need to be pressing, we as consumers need to be pressing platforms like Facebook to be doing more like flagging with fact checks and be more careful ourselves in not spreading stuff around.
I mean, if anyone is interested, I just finished a 100-page report that looks at this whole issue, and you know, one of the things to really think about is, you know, why is this happening, and should Facebook and Google be responsible? Do you want them controlling what you see? They don't want to be the arbiters of truth, but we're pushing them, and you know, one of the questions I was going to ask is, should they be regulated? But I think we want to open it up to the audience, if someone wants to